A woman stands at an altar, not for love, but as payment for a debt. Her father gambled away everything, and now she's being traded to a scarred stranger who lives alone in the frozen mountains. The entire town expects her to disappear into the wilderness and never return. But what no one knows, not her father, not the church, not even herself, is that this humiliating bargain will become the greatest rebellion of her life. Before you judge her silence at that altar, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Evelyn's journey travels. Because what happens next? Nobody saw it coming. The Church of Black Hollow smelled wrong that morning. Evelyn Mercer noticed it the moment she stepped through the heavy oak doors, dust mixed with old wood, candle wax that had burned too long, and something else underneath it all. Fear, maybe. Or shame. She couldn't tell which one belonged to her and which one had seeped into the walls over decades of secrets kept and sins ignored. 26 years old, and this was how her story was supposed to end. Standing at an altar in a dress that didn't fit right, stitched too tight across the shoulders because her stepmother hadn't bothered to measure properly. Or maybe she had measured perfectly and chosen this on purpose. One final cruelty wrapped in white fabric. The pews were full. Of course they were. Nobody in Black Hollow would miss this. Evelyn kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the faces she'd known her entire life. The same faces that had whispered behind gloved hands when she walked past. The same voices that had called her unmarriageable, unlovable, too big, too plain, too difficult to ever find a decent man. And now here they all were, watching her get exactly what they'd always predicted, a desperate arrangement made out of necessity, not choice. Her father sat in the front pew, hands folded in his lap like he was praying. Thomas Mercer had always been good at looking pious when it suited him. Good at looking like a victim of circumstance rather than the gambling drunk who'd destroyed his own family one card game at a time. 3 weeks ago, he'd lost the house. 2 weeks ago, he'd lost the store. 10 days ago, men had come to collect, and Thomas Mercer had offered them the only thing he had left to bargain with, his daughter. Evelyn had heard the entire conversation from the top of the stairs. Her father's voice, slurred and desperate. The cold response from Samuel Cross, the man who held every debt in this town like a noose. And then the solution, delivered with the casual cruelty of a business transaction. There's a healer up in the high country, name's Gideon Vale. He sent word months ago that he'd pay good money for a wife, strong woman, someone who can work. He doesn't care about pretty. He needs useful. Useful. That was the word that had cut deepest. Not even valuable. Just useful. Her father had agreed before dawn. Now the church doors opened again, and every head turned. Evelyn didn't turn. She didn't need to. She could feel the change in the room, the way the air got heavier, the way the whispers stopped all at once, the way even the crying baby in the back pew went suddenly quiet. Gideon Vale had arrived. The footsteps coming up the aisle were slow and deliberate, heavy boots on old wood. Evelyn finally let herself glance sideways, just enough to see him in her peripheral vision. Tall. Broader than most men she'd seen. A long coat that looked like it had weathered 100 storms, dark and worn at the edges. His face was turned slightly away, but she caught the edge of a scar running down from his temple to his jaw. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples, despite him looking no older than 40. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like a savior either. He just looked tired. Reverend Pritchard stepped forward, clearing his throat importantly. He was enjoying this too much. Evelyn could see it in the way he puffed out his chest, the way his voice took on that performative solemnity he used for funerals and public shamings. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Evelyn Rose Mercer and Gideon Vale, in accordance with the agreement made between Thomas Mercer and Stop! The single word cut through the Reverend's speech like a blade. Gideon Vale's voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention. He stepped past the Reverend without looking at him, moving to stand directly in front of Evelyn. For the first time, she looked up and met his eyes. They were gray, storm cloud gray, and they were looking at her like she was a person, not a transaction. "I'm not doing this," Gideon said. The church erupted. Her father lurched to his feet. "Now wait just a minute. We had an agreement." I agreed to meet a woman who might want a different life, Gideon said, still looking at Evelyn. I didn't agree to a livestock trade. Evelyn's face burned. Around her, the congregation was buzzing with scandalized whispers. She could hear Mrs. Hallowell's voice rising above the others. I told you he was unnatural, living up there alone all those years. You. Gideon's attention hadn't wavered from Evelyn's face. What's your name? You know my name, she said quietly. It's in the agreement. I know what your father calls you. I'm asking what you want to be called. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Evelyn, she said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected. Just Evelyn. Evelyn. He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. I came here because I need help, real help. The work I do up in the high country, healing, delivering medicine to settlements, helping people who can't make it down the mountain to a real doctor, it's too much for one person. I thought maybe there was a woman in this town who wanted out badly enough to take a chance on something different. But I'm not interested in buying a wife, and I'm sure as hell not interested in taking someone who doesn't want to go. He took a step back, giving her space. So here's what I'm offering. You can stay here. I'll pay your father's debts anyway. Call it charity, call it whatever you want. You owe me nothing, or... He paused. You can come with me, not as a wife, as an apprentice. I'll teach you everything I know about healing, about surviving in the mountains, about building a life that's yours. You'll work hard, harder than you've ever worked in your life. You'll earn your place. And if you decide after a month that you'd rather be back here, I'll bring you back myself. No questions, no debts. The silence that followed was absolute. Evelyn's mind was racing. This wasn't how this was supposed to happen. Men didn't offer choices. They didn't ask permission. They definitely didn't stand in front of a church full of witnesses and refuse to claim what they'd already paid for. She looked past Gideon to where her father sat, and for just a moment, Thomas Mercer's mask slipped. She saw the calculation in his eyes. The debt would be paid either way. He'd get what he wanted. He didn't actually care which option she chose. He had never cared. Show me who you really are, Gideon said quietly, and Evelyn's attention snapped back to him. Not who this town says you are, not who your father needed you to be to settle his debts, who you actually are, underneath all of that. Something cracked open inside her chest. 26 years of being told she wasn't enough. 26 years of making herself smaller, quieter, more acceptable. 26 years of watching her mother die of a fever while her father drank away the money that could have paid for medicine. 26 years of knowing that in this town, she would always be the unmarriageable Mercer girl, the one who should be grateful for any scraps of attention she received. And here was a stranger offering her a door she hadn't even known existed. I'll go, Evelyn said. The church erupted again, louder this time. Her stepmother was on her feet, screeching something about impropriety and scandal. Reverend Pritchard was stammering, trying to regain control of the situation. Her father just sat there, silent, already counting money he hadn't earned. Gideon ignored all of it. He held out his hand to Evelyn, not to take her, but offering her the choice to take it. She did. His hand was rough, calloused from years of work, warm despite the cold morning, steady. Get whatever you want to bring, he said. I'll wait outside. He turned and walked back down the aisle, his boots echoing in the chaos. The crowd parted for him like he carried weather with him, something wild and untamed that civilized people instinctively avoided. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, then gathered up the skirt of her too-tight dress and followed him. Behind her, she heard her stepmother's voice. Evelyn Rose Mercer, if you walk out that door, you are not welcome back. She kept walking. Outside, the morning was crisp and clear. Gideon was already at his horse, checking the saddle straps. A second horse stood beside his, smaller, already packed with supplies. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said without turning around, but I brought a horse for you anyway. Why? The question came out before she could stop it. Because hope costs nothing, Gideon said simply, and I'd rather be wrong about people than assume the worst. Evelyn looked back at the church. Through the windows she could see shapes moving, people arguing. In a few minutes someone would come out to try to stop her. Her father, maybe, or the reverend, or just the collective force of the town's disapproval. I don't have anything to bring, she said. Everything in that house belongs to my father. Legally, I suppose it belongs to his creditors now. Gideon finally turned to look at her. You're bringing yourself, that's enough. He swung up into his saddle with the ease of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. Then he offered his hand down to her. Ever ridden before? Only twice, when I was a child. You'll learn, he said. Step into the stirrup. I'll pull you up. It was awkward and graceless, and Evelyn was painfully aware of how her dress was completely wrong for this, how she probably looked ridiculous trying to settle into the saddle. But Gideon didn't comment. He just waited until she had the reins, then nodded. Follow my lead. The trail's clear until we hit the foothills. After that, stay close. They rode out of Black Hollow as the church bells began to ring, someone's idea of a final condemnation maybe, or just marking the hour. Evelyn didn't look back to see which. The town fell away behind them slowly, buildings giving way to farms, farms giving way to open country. The road stretched out ahead, rising gradually toward the mountain range that dominated the northern horizon. Evelyn had lived her entire life in the shadow of those mountains, but she'd never actually been up into them. They were just a backdrop, permanent and unchanging. Now they looked different, closer, real. After an hour of riding in silence, Gideon slowed his horse until they were riding side by side. You scared? He asked. Evelyn considered lying, considered giving the answer that would make her seem braver, stronger, more capable. Then she remembered what he'd said in the church. Show me who you really are. Terrified, she admitted. Gideon nodded like that was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Good. That means you're paying attention. Fear's not weakness, it's information. It tells you when to be careful, when to prepare, when to respect what you're up against. It's the people who aren't scared that get themselves killed in the high country. Is it really that dangerous? Yes. He didn't soften it, didn't try to make it sound less severe. Weather changes fast. Animals are hungry. Trails wash out. People get lost, get hurt, get desperate. And we're usually the only help for 50 miles in any direction. We? Evelyn asked. If you stay, Gideon corrected. If you decide this life isn't for you, there's no shame in that. Most people aren't built for isolation and hard work. Most people need community, need comfort, need the kind of safety that only comes from being surrounded by other people. Is that what you need? He was quiet for a long moment. I used to think I needed to be alone. Simpler that way. No one to disappoint, no one to lose. He glanced at her. I'm starting to think I was wrong about that. They rode on. Around midday, Gideon pulled off the main trail toward a small trading post that sat at the junction of 3 roads. It was barely more than a shack with a porch, but smoke rose from the chimney and horses were tied outside. Wait here, Gideon said, dismounting. He disappeared inside while Evelyn sat on her horse, acutely aware of how she looked, still in her church dress, completely unprepared for anything resembling wilderness travel. A couple of rough-looking men on the porch watched her with undisguised curiosity, but when Gideon emerged with his arms full of supplies, they quickly found other things to look at. He tied the bundle to her saddle without explanation, then mounted his horse again. What? Evelyn started. Open it later, he said gruffly, already moving back toward the trail. They didn't stop again until the sun was starting to sink toward the western peaks. Gideon led them off the trail to a clearing beside a narrow creek. While he tended to the horses, Evelyn finally untied the bundle he'd bought. Inside was everything she hadn't known she needed: thick woolen socks, sturdy leather boots sized for a woman, lined gloves, a heavy coat with a hood, and a wide-brimmed hat. At the bottom was a basic bedroll and a tin cup. Her throat went tight. These weren't expensive things. They weren't fancy. But they were chosen. Someone had looked at her and thought about what she would need to survive, to be comfortable, to stay warm. Someone had seen her standing there in a dress meant for a church wedding and understood that she needed armor of a different kind. Thank you, she said when Gideon returned with firewood. He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. Can't have you freezing before you even see the cabin. Wouldn't reflect well on me. But his ears were red, and he turned away quickly to build the fire. They ate a simple meal of dried meat and hard bread. The fire crackled between them, pushing back the darkness that was gathering under the trees. Above, the first stars were appearing. How much further? Evelyn asked. 3 more days if the weather holds, Gideon said. 5 if we hit rain. Could be longer if snow comes early. It does sometimes, up high. And you make this trip regularly, down to town and back? Every few months for supplies, more often if someone sends word they need help. He poked at the fire with a stick. There's other settlements up in the high country, smaller than Black Hollow. Mining camps, lumber operations, families who wanted land nobody else wanted. They need medicine sometimes. Need someone who knows how to set bones or deliver babies or treat frostbite. That's what I do. And you do it alone, have been for 6 years. He looked at her across the fire. My wife died. Fever took her one winter. I tried everything I knew, but it wasn't enough. After that, I couldn't stay in the settlement we'd built together. Too many ghosts. So I moved higher up, built a new cabin, kept working, kept busy, stayed alone because it was easier than risking that kind of loss again. Evelyn understood that. The staying busy part, the avoiding risk part. She'd done her own version of it, making herself invisible in Black Hollow, never hoping for more than survival, never reaching for anything that might be taken away. I'm sorry, she said. About your wife. Her name was Sarah. Gideon said it like he didn't get to say it out loud very often. She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for people who judged others for things that didn't matter. Size, appearance, status. She thought all of it was noise that kept people from seeing what was real. What's real? Whether someone's kind, whether they work hard, whether they show up when it matters. He met her eyes. Everything else is just decoration. The fire popped, sending sparks up into the darkness. Why did you really come to Black Hollow? Evelyn asked. You could have found help in a dozen other towns, somewhere closer, somewhere with better options. Gideon was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, because I heard about a woman whose father was selling her to settle gambling debts, and I thought maybe she'd want a way out that didn't involve another man making choices for her. He shrugged. Figured it was worth the trip to find out if I was right. You came all that way for a stranger. I came all that way because I know what it's like to feel trapped, Gideon said. And because I remember what it meant when someone offered me a choice I didn't think I had. Figured I could pay that forward. Evelyn pulled the new coat tighter around her shoulders. The night was getting cold, but she barely felt it. For the first time in her life, she was starting to understand what safety might actually feel like. Not the false safety of keeping quiet and making herself small. Real safety. The kind that came from being seen clearly and chosen anyway. I'm not good at this, she said suddenly. Any of this. Riding, camping, surviving in the wilderness. I don't know anything about healing or medicine. I've never been more than 10 miles from Black Hollow. I'm going to slow you down, make mistakes, probably need help with everything. Yep, Gideon agreed easily. So why... Because you said yes when you could have said no, he interrupted. Because you chose the harder path when the easier one was right there. That tells me more about who you are than any skill ever could. Skills can be taught. Character can't. He stood up, brushing dirt from his pants. Get some sleep. We've got a long ride tomorrow, and the trail gets rougher from here. Evelyn wrapped herself in the bedroll, watching the fire burn low. Above her, the sky was filled with more stars than she'd ever seen. In Black Hollow, there were always lamps burning, always smoke from chimneys obscuring the view. Out here, there was nothing between her and the infinite. She should have been afraid. She was lying on the ground in the middle of nowhere with a man she barely knew, riding toward a future she couldn't predict. But instead she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm of riding, resting, and learning. Gideon pointed out landmarks, taught her how to read the trail, showed her which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make her sick. He corrected her posture in the saddle without making her feel stupid. When her hands blistered from gripping the reins wrong, he gave her salve and wrapped them without comment. The landscape changed as they climbed higher. The gentle hills gave way to steeper slopes. Trees grew closer together, taller, darker. The air got thinner, colder, sharper. On the third day, it started to rain. Not a gentle rain, but the kind of cold, driving rain that soaked through clothes and made every exposed inch of skin ache. Gideon pulled up his hood and kept riding without complaint. So Evelyn did the same, even though her teeth were chattering and her fingers had gone numb inside her new gloves. They took shelter under an overhang of rock when the rain turned to sleet. Gideon built a fire somehow, even though everything was wet. He handed Evelyn his own dry shirt from his pack and turned his back while she changed, hanging her soaked dress near the flames. "First rule of the high country," he said, staring determinedly at the rock wall. "Stay dry if you can. If you can't, get dry as soon as possible. Wet and cold together will kill you faster than almost anything else up here." "Noted," Evelyn said through chattering teeth. "Second rule, never be too proud to ask for help. Your pride isn't worth your fingers." He turned around then, and Evelyn was suddenly very aware that she was wearing his shirt, which hung on her like a dress, and nothing else. But Gideon's eyes didn't linger. He just handed her a blanket and went back to tending the fire. "Third rule," he continued, "the mountain doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care if you're tired or scared or hurt. It just is what it is. Your job is to respect that and prepare accordingly." "Are there more rules?" Evelyn asked. "Hundreds," Gideon said. "But those 3 will keep you alive while you learn the rest." The sleet continued for hours. They couldn't ride in it. The trails were too dangerous, visibility too poor. So they waited, sitting close to the fire, sharing the small amount of food they'd kept dry. "Tell me about the cabin," Evelyn said eventually. "What's it like?" Gideon considered the question. "Small. 2 rooms, sturdy. I built it myself after Sarah died, so it's not fancy, but it keeps out the wind and the snow. There's a root cellar for storing food and medicine, a workshop where I prepare remedies, a small barn for the horses and goats." "Goats?" "4 of them, mean as hell, but they give milk and cheese, and they're better at navigating steep terrain than horses." He almost smiled. "You'll meet Brutus first. He's the herd leader. He'll try to intimidate you. Don't let him." "Does he actually bite?" "Only if you show fear," Gideon said seriously, then added, "I'm joking, mostly." It was the first joke she'd heard him make, and it surprised a laugh out of her. Gideon looked startled by the sound, like he'd forgotten what laughter sounded like. The sleet finally stopped as darkness fell. They stayed under the overhang for the night, the fire burning between them. Evelyn fell asleep to the sound of water dripping from the rocks, and Gideon's steady breathing across the fire. She woke once in the deepest part of night and saw that he'd draped his coat over her blanket while she slept. He sat by the fire with just his shirt, keeping watch, keeping the flames going, keeping her safe. Evelyn closed her eyes again and let herself believe just for a moment that this might actually work, that she might actually survive this, that the life Gideon was offering her might be real and not just another version of the same trap. When she woke again, it was to gray dawn light and the smell of coffee. Gideon was already up, already moving, already preparing for the day's ride. "Last push," he said when he saw her stirring. "If we ride hard and the weather holds, we'll make it to the cabin before dark." Evelyn sat up, accepting the cup of coffee he handed her. Her dress was dry but stiff from the fire. She put it back on anyway, layering the new coat over it. "I'm ready," she said. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded. "Yeah, I think you might be." They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the wet world in shades of gold and amber. The trail climbed steeply now, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Below them, the valley spread out like a map, everything they'd left behind getting smaller with every mile. Evelyn didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the path ahead, on the broad shoulders of the man leading her toward a future she couldn't yet see but was beginning to believe might be worth reaching for. The mountains rose up around them, massive and ancient and indifferent to human suffering. But for the first time in her life, Evelyn didn't feel small in the face of something greater than herself. She felt like she was finally the right size. Just herself. Just Evelyn. And maybe, just maybe, that was going to be enough. The cabin appeared just as the last light was bleeding out of the sky, a dark shape against darker trees, smoke rising thin and straight from a stone chimney. It sat in a clearing that had been carved out of the forest with what must have been years of brutal work, surrounded by stumps that told the story of every tree that had been felled to make room for this small piece of civilization. Evelyn's whole body ached. 4 days in the saddle had left her muscles screaming and her backside so sore she wasn't sure she'd ever sit comfortably again. But she didn't complain. Gideon had been watching her carefully all day, looking for signs that she was reaching her limit, and she'd be damned if she gave him a reason to doubt her after they'd come this far. "Home," Gideon said, and there was something in his voice, relief maybe, or the kind of tired satisfaction that came from finishing a hard journey. He dismounted and came around to help her down. Evelyn's legs buckled the moment her feet hit the ground, and Gideon caught her elbow to steady her. "First long ride's always the worst," he said. "Give it a day. Your body will adjust." "Promise?" Her voice came out more strained than she'd intended. "No, but it'll hurt less, which is almost the same thing." He led the horses to a small barn while Evelyn stood in the clearing, trying to get her legs to remember how to hold weight. The air up here was different, thinner, colder, so clean it almost hurt to breathe. The silence was absolute except for the wind moving through the pines and the distant sound of water running somewhere in the darkness. No voices, no wagons, no church bells or town gossip, or neighbors watching from windows. Just space. Endless, terrifying space. "Come on," Gideon called from the cabin door. "Let's get you inside before you freeze standing there." The interior was exactly what he'd described. Small and practical and built by someone who cared more about function than appearance. One main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars and bottles and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. A door on the far wall led to what Evelyn assumed was the bedroom. Everything was clean but worn, used hard and cared for out of necessity rather than affection. Gideon was already building up the fire, coaxing reluctant flames from the banked coals he'd left before his trip to Black Hollow. The light grew, pushing back shadows, revealing more details. A rocking chair near the hearth, a stack of books on a corner shelf, a rifle mounted above the door. Medical instruments laid out on a cloth near the window, scalpels, forceps, needles, things Evelyn didn't have names for yet. "Bedroom's through there," Gideon said, not looking up from the fire. "It's yours. I'll sleep out here." Evelyn turned to stare at him. "You're giving me your bedroom?" "I'm giving you privacy." He stood up, brushing ash from his hands. "You came here as an apprentice, not a wife. That means you get your own space. I'll build a second room come spring, but for now, this works." "Where will you sleep?" He gestured to a bedroll already laid out near the far wall. "Same place I've been sleeping for 6 months, closer to the fire anyway." It was such a small thing, such an obvious thing, maybe, for anyone else. But Evelyn had grown up in a house where privacy was a luxury, where her stepmother had routinely gone through her things, where doors didn't have locks and nowhere was truly hers. The idea that this stranger was giving her a room with a door that closed without asking for anything in return, without even making it seem like a sacrifice. Her throat went tight. "Thank you," she managed. Gideon just nodded and went back to unpacking supplies. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. Supper will be ready in an hour. Nothing fancy, just stew from what I had stored before I left." The bedroom was smaller than the main room, barely big enough for the narrow bed pushed against one wall and a trunk at its foot. But it had a window that looked out into the forest, and the bed had actual blankets, and when Evelyn closed the door, she was alone for the first time in 4 days. She sat down on the edge of the bed and let herself shake. Not from cold, not from fear. From the sheer overwhelming weight of change. 4 days ago, she'd been standing in a church in a town that had never wanted her, about to be traded like property. Now she was in a cabin on the side of a mountain with a man who barely spoke but somehow kept doing things that made her want to cry from the simple decency of them. She didn't know how to process that. Didn't know what to do with kindness that came without strings attached. So she washed her face in the cold water, changed out of her church dress, and into the spare clothes Gideon had included in the supplies he'd bought, and went back out to face whatever came next. Gideon was at the stove, stirring a pot that smelled better than Evelyn had expected. He'd changed too, out of his travel clothes and into a worn flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The scars on his arms were more visible now, old burns mostly, the kind you got from working over fires and hot metal. "Can I help?" Evelyn asked. "Can you cut bread without losing a finger?" "Probably." He pointed to a loaf on the table and a knife beside it. "Then make yourself useful." They worked in companionable silence. Gideon ladled stew into bowls. Evelyn cut bread that was denser and darker than anything they'd baked in Black Hollow, probably made from grain he'd ground himself. They sat across from each other at the small table, and for a few minutes the only sound was spoons scraping bowls. The stew was good, simple, Just meat and root vegetables and herbs, but good. Real food, made by someone who understood that eating was about survival first and pleasure second. Tomorrow we start your education, Gideon said eventually. I'll show you around the property, introduce you to the goats, teach you where everything is stored. Day after that, we'll start on basic medicine. How to recognize common plants, how to make simple remedies, how to clean and dress a wound properly. How long does it usually take to learn everything you know? Gideon almost smiled. I've been doing this for 20 years and I'm still learning, but you'll know enough to be useful in a few months, enough to save a life in 6 months if you pay attention. And if I don't pay attention? Then someone dies because you weren't prepared. He said it flatly, without malice. That's the reality up here. We're the only medical help for 50 miles. When someone comes to this door bleeding or fevered or in labor, we don't get to say we're not ready yet. We figure it out or people suffer. The weight of that settled over Evelyn like a physical thing. She'd thought she understood what Gideon was offering her. A new life, useful work, freedom from Black Hollow's judgment. But she hadn't fully grasped the responsibility that came with it. People would depend on her. Lives would rest in her hands. I'll pay attention, she said quietly. Good. Gideon stood, collecting their empty bowls. Get some sleep. Morning comes early, and you'll need your strength. Evelyn retreated to her room and lay down on the narrow bed, listening to Gideon move around the main room, banking the fire, checking the door, settling into his own bedroll. The sounds were strangely comforting, proof that she wasn't alone up here, that someone else was keeping watch while she slept. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. The sound that woke her wasn't loud, but it was wrong somehow. Urgent and distressed in a way that cut through sleep like a blade. Evelyn sat up in the dark, disoriented, trying to place where she was and what she was hearing. A knock. Someone was knocking on the cabin door. No, pounding, desperate. She heard Gideon's voice, low and calm. I'm coming. Step back from the door. Evelyn pulled on her coat and emerged from the bedroom to find Gideon already at the door, rifle in hand but pointed at the floor. He opened it carefully, and a man stumbled inside, half carrying another man who was unconscious and bleeding from a gash across his forehead. Logging accident, the first man gasped. Tree came down wrong, caught him across the skull. We carried him 2 miles, didn't know where else to go. Get him on the table, Gideon ordered, already moving. Evelyn, I need you to stoke the fire and put water on to boil. Now. She didn't question it, didn't hesitate. She just moved, feeding wood into the fireplace, hanging the kettle on its hook, her hands shaking but functional. Behind her, Gideon was already examining the injured man, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Evelyn, bring me the bottle marked arnica from the shelf, third from the left, and clean cloth. There's a stack in the trunk by my bedroll. She found the bottle, found the cloth, brought both to the table. The injured man was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 20, with blood matting his dark hair and running down into his eyes. Hold this against the wound, Gideon told the other man. Firm pressure, don't let up. Then to Evelyn, watch what I'm doing. You'll need to know this. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound, checking the man's pupils, feeling along his skull for fractures. His hands were steady despite the blood, despite the unconscious man's occasional moans of pain. Skull's intact, he said finally. Concussion for sure, but he'll live if infection doesn't set in. Evelyn, pour some of that arnica into the hot water. We need to clean this properly before I stitch it. She did as instructed, trying not to look at the amount of blood on the table, on Gideon's hands soaking into the cloth. The other man, the one who'd carried his friend, looked like he might pass out himself. Sit down before you fall down, Gideon told him, not unkindly. You did good getting him here. That's the hard part done. Will he be all right? Probably. Head wounds bleed like hell, but they heal if you're careful. Gideon was threading a needle now, his movements precise. What's his name? Thomas. Thomas Pritchett. We work the lumber camp about 5 miles north. Evelyn, hold his head still, Gideon said. Thomas, if you wake up, I need you to stay very still. This is going to hurt, but it has to be done. The stitching took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Thomas did wake up once, thrashing and confused, and it took both Evelyn and the other man, who said his name was Jack, to keep him still enough for Gideon to finish. When it was done, Gideon wrapped the wound in clean bandages and stepped back. He needs to stay still for at least 2 days, he told Jack. No moving around, no working. Someone needs to watch him. If he starts vomiting or can't wake up properly, you come get me immediately. Understand?" Jack nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We didn't know if—" "You did the right thing bringing him here." Gideon was already cleaning his tools, wiping blood from the table. "Can you get him back to camp by yourself, or do you need help?" "I can manage. We brought a horse, left it outside." Between the three of them, they got Thomas out to the waiting horse and draped across its back. Jack led the animal away into the darkness, calling his thanks over his shoulder. Gideon stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching them disappear into the trees. Then he closed the door and turned to find Evelyn standing frozen in the middle of the room, staring at her hands. They were covered in blood. "First time?" Gideon asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. "Come here." He led her to the basin, poured fresh water, and handed her a cloth. She scrubbed at her hands mechanically, watching the water turn pink. "You did well," Gideon said. "I didn't do anything. I just handed you things." "You handed me the right things at the right time. You held still when I needed you to. You didn't panic." He dried his own hands on a towel. "That's more than most people manage their first emergency." "Does this happen a lot?" "Often enough." He was putting away the medical supplies, returning everything to its proper place. Logging accidents, hunting accidents, falls, sickness, difficult births. Sometimes it's minor, sometimes it's not. He paused. "Sometimes people die despite everything we do. You need to know that going in, we're not miracle workers. We're just people with knowledge and tools, doing the best we can." Evelyn sat down heavily in one of the chairs. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her shaky and exhausted. "How do you stand it? Knowing that people's lives depend on you getting it right?" "Because the alternative is worse," Gideon said simply. "If I'm not here, they have nothing, no help at all. So I show up, do the work, and try not to think too hard about the weight of it." He looked at her. "You can still change your mind. Go back to Black Hollow. This life isn't for everyone, and there's no shame in knowing your limits." Evelyn thought about it, really thought about it. About the blood on her hands and the weight of responsibility and the reality that this was what the rest of her life would look like if she stayed. Then she thought about the alternative, going back to a town that had never wanted her, living in the shadow of her father's failures, spending the rest of her life invisible and unnecessary. "Teach me," she said. "Teach me everything." Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Respect, maybe, or relief. "All right then, get some sleep. We'll start fresh in the morning." But morning came too soon, announced by a rooster Evelyn hadn't known existed crowing somewhere outside. She dragged herself out of bed to find Gideon already up, already dressed, already moving through his morning routine like he hadn't been up half the night stitching a man's head back together. "Coffee's hot," he said without looking up from the bread he was slicing. "Drink it fast. We've got animals to feed." The goats, as promised, were mean as hell. Brutus, the leader, took one look at Evelyn and charged, stopping just short of actually hitting her but making his dominance absolutely clear. The other three, which Gideon identified as Caesar, Napoleon, and Trouble, followed their leader's example with varying degrees of enthusiasm. "Don't run," Gideon said, watching from the fence. "Stand your ground. They're testing you." "What happens if I fail the test?" "They'll make your life miserable until you pass it." Evelyn held her ground. Brutus snorted, pawed the earth once more for good measure, then turned and trotted away like she wasn't worth his time. The others followed. "Congratulations," Gideon said. "You've been accepted. Barely." The rest of the morning was a blur of new information. Gideon showed her where everything was stored: grain for the animals, preserved food for humans, firewood, tools, emergency supplies. He taught her how to milk the goats, which was harder than it looked, and resulted in more milk on Evelyn than in the bucket. He explained the water system, how he diverted a stream to run through a series of channels that kept the animals watered and provided washing water for the cabin. "Everything up here is about preparation," he said as they worked. "Winter comes hard and stays long. If you're not ready, you die. Simple as that." "How long does winter last?" 7 months, usually. Snow starts in October, doesn't fully clear until May, sometimes longer. He was measuring out grain for the goats. "We stock up in September, preserve everything we can, hunt, dry meat, store root vegetables. Once the heavy snow comes, we're cut off from the lowlands until spring thaw." "What if someone needs help during winter?" "Then we go to them." Or they come to us if they can. I've delivered babies in blizzards, set bones in mining camps during whiteouts, pulled people out of frozen creeks. He shrugged. You do what needs doing. They worked through midday, stopping only for a quick meal of bread and cheese. Evelyn's body was already protesting, her muscles sore from riding, her hands raw from unfamiliar work, her head spinning with new information. But she kept going, kept pushing, determined to prove she could handle this. In the afternoon, Gideon took her into the forest. This is where the real work begins, he said, leading her along a narrow trail that wound between massive pines. Medicine doesn't come from bottles and jars. It comes from here, from the plants that grow in these mountains. If you can't identify them, harvest them properly, and prepare them correctly, people suffer. He stopped beside a low-growing plant with silvery green leaves. Yarrow. Good for stopping bleeding, reducing fever, easing headaches. You can make it into tea or crush it into a poultice, but you have to know what you're looking at. There are plants that look similar but won't help at all, and some that will make things worse. For the next 3 hours, he walked her through the forest, pointing out plants, making her repeat their names and uses until she could recognize them on sight. Arnica for bruises and inflammation, willow bark for pain, elderberry for immune support, echinacea for infection, comfrey for broken bones. Write it down when we get back, Gideon told her. Everything you learned today. Drawing helps too. Sketch what the plants look like so you'll remember. Medical knowledge isn't worth anything if you can't recall it when it matters. By the time they returned to the cabin, Evelyn's head was so full of information she felt like it might burst. She collapsed into a chair while Gideon started preparing supper, her notebook open in front of her, trying to capture everything before she forgot. Don't try to learn it all at once, Gideon said, glancing over at her. Give it time. We'll go out every day, focus on a few plants each time. Eventually, it'll stick. How long did it take you? Years. He was cutting vegetables with practiced efficiency. My father was a healer, started teaching me when I was 7. I'm 38 now and I still find new uses for old plants. Evelyn did the math. Gideon had been doing this for 31 years. She was trying to compress that knowledge into months. The impossibility of it hit her like a weight. Hey, Gideon's voice cut through her spiral. Stop that. Stop what? Drowning before you've even gotten in the water. He pointed at her with the knife. You're not trying to know everything I know. You're trying to know enough to help. There's a difference. What if enough isn't enough? Then we'll deal with it together. He went back to his cutting. You're not alone in this, Evelyn. That's the whole point of having an apprentice. We share the load. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Wake before dawn. Feed the animals. Breakfast. Then the real work. Learning plants in the morning, practicing medicine in the afternoon. Gideon would create scenarios, test her knowledge, make her walk through treatment step by step until she could do it without thinking. Patient comes in with a burn, he'd say. What do you do? Cool it immediately. Clean water, not ice. Assess the severity. First degree, just the top layer, treat with aloe or honey. Keep it clean. Second degree, blistering. Same treatment, but watch for infection. Third degree, stop. Third degree, you're already in trouble. What's the real danger? Shock. Blood loss. Infection. Good. So you're not just treating the burn, you're watching for, secondary complications that might kill them before the burn does. Exactly. The lessons were relentless, but Gideon was a patient teacher. When she made mistakes, and she made plenty, he corrected her without making her feel stupid. When she got things right, he acknowledged it with a nod or a quiet good that somehow meant more than elaborate praise. And slowly, impossibly, she began to understand. The knowledge started connecting, forming patterns, making sense. She could look at a plant and know what it did. She could assess an injury and know what to treat first. Her hands learned to clean wounds without hesitating, to wrap bandages properly, to mix remedies with the right proportions. But it wasn't just medical knowledge that Gideon taught her. He taught her how to read weather patterns in the shape of clouds, how to predict storms by the behavior of animals. He taught her how to track deer, how to skin and butcher game, how to preserve meat for winter. He taught her which berries were safe to eat and which would kill you, how to find water when the streams were frozen, how to build a fire in wet conditions. He taught her how to survive. And somewhere in the teaching, In the long days working side by side, in the quiet evenings after supper where they'd sit by the fire and he'd share stories about the people he'd helped over the years, something began to shift between them. It was in the small things. The way Gideon started leaving the larger portion of meat on her plate without comment. The way he'd notice when she was cold and add wood to the fire before she had to ask. The way he'd position himself between her and danger whenever someone unknown came to the door. And on her side, the way she started mending his clothes while he was out checking traps. The way she'd make sure his coffee was exactly how he liked it. The way she found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps coming back to the cabin at the end of the day. Neither of them acknowledged it. Neither of them named it. But it was there, growing in the spaces between words. One evening in late November, 6 weeks after she'd arrived, Evelyn was preparing a poultice when the bowl slipped from her hands. She grabbed for it instinctively and caught the edge of the hot stove instead. The pain was immediate and sharp. She jerked back with a hiss, clutching her hand. Gideon was across the room in 2 strides. "Let me see." She held out her hand. The burn ran across her palm, already starting to blister. Not serious, but painful. Gideon's jaw tightened. He grabbed her wrist, gently, despite the tension in his body, and pulled her to the basin. He plunged her hand into the cold water he'd drawn earlier, holding it there even when she tried to pull away. "Keep it there," he said, his voice rough. With his free hand, he reached for the jar of salve they kept near the stove, the same mixture he'd taught her to make weeks ago. When he finally pulled her hand from the water, he dried it carefully and applied the salve with fingers that trembled slightly. Evelyn watched his face, watched the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his hands, usually so steady, shook as he wrapped her palm in clean cloth. "It's just a small burn," she said quietly. "I know." He didn't look up. "Doesn't mean I have to like seeing you hurt." The words hung in the air between them. Gideon finished tying off the bandage and stepped back quickly, like he'd realized he'd said too much. "Thank you," Evelyn said. He turned away, busying himself with cleaning up the spilled poultice mixture. "Be more careful next time." That night, after Gideon had gone to his bedroll and the cabin had settled into silence, Evelyn lay in her narrow bed and replayed the moment over and over. The way he'd grabbed her wrist, the trembling in his hands, the roughness in his voice that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with something he wasn't ready to admit. She pressed her bandaged hand against her chest and felt her heart beating too fast. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. She was supposed to learn medicine, earn her place, build a new life. Not fall for the man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. But the heart, Evelyn was learning, didn't care much about plans. The first snow came in early December. Not the light dusting that Black Hollow got, but real snow that buried the clearing in 3 feet of white overnight. Evelyn woke to a world transformed, everything softened and muffled and impossibly quiet. Gideon was already outside, cutting a path from the cabin to the barn. She dressed quickly and joined him, grabbing the second shovel without being asked. They worked in silence, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The physical labor felt good after being cooped up, and Evelyn found herself almost enjoying it despite the cold. "This is nothing," Gideon said, reading her thoughts. "Wait until January. We'll get storms that bury the cabin to the roofline. Sometimes we have to dig out the chimney just to keep the smoke from backing up inside. How do people survive out here?" Carefully. He stopped to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "And with help. That's why we're here." As if summoned by his words, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. A woman on a horse, moving slowly through the deep snow, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. Gideon's shovel hit the ground. "Evelyn, get the cabin ready. Fresh linens on the table, water boiling, bring out the birthing kit." "Birthing kit?" Wooden box on the top shelf. "You'll know it when you see it." He was already moving toward the woman. "And calm down. Babies don't care if you're ready. They come anyway." Evelyn ran. The birthing kit was exactly where Gideon had said it would be. A wooden box with worn handles that had clearly been opened hundreds of times. Evelyn's hand shook as she brought it down, nearly dropping it when she heard the woman outside cry out in pain. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to remember everything Gideon had taught her about staying calm in emergencies. Panic helped no one. Action did. By the time Gideon helped the woman through the door, Evelyn had the table cleared and covered with clean linens, water boiling on the stove, and the contents of the birthing kit laid out like she'd seen Gideon do with his medical instruments. She didn't know if it was right, but it was something. The woman was young, maybe 22, with dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the cold. Her face was pale except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks, and she was breathing in short, sharp gasps. "This is Margaret Chen," Gideon said, helping her toward the table. "Margaret, this is Evelyn. She's going to help me." "Baby's coming too fast," Margaret panted. "Husband's gone to the lumber camp. Won't be back for 2 days. Couldn't wait." "You did the right thing coming here," Gideon said, his voice dropping into that calm, authoritative tone he used during emergencies. "How far apart are the pains?" "Close. Maybe 2 minutes." Gideon's expression didn't change, but Evelyn saw something flash in his eyes. That was fast. Too fast for a first baby, which this clearly was based on Margaret's age and the way she was gripping the edge of the table like she didn't know what her body was doing. "Evelyn, I need you to help her onto the table and get her comfortable," Gideon said, already scrubbing his hands in the basin. "Talk to her. Keep her calm. I'll be right there." Evelyn moved to Margaret's side, supporting her weight as another contraction hit. The woman's fingers dug into Evelyn's arm hard enough to bruise, but Evelyn didn't pull away. "I've got you," she said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Let's get you settled." Getting a woman in active labor onto a table was harder than it sounded. Margaret couldn't climb up on her own, and Evelyn wasn't strong enough to lift her. Gideon finished washing and came to help, and between the two of them they managed to get her positioned. Margaret immediately curled onto her side, groaning. "How many weeks?" Gideon asked, checking her pulse. 38, I think. Maybe 39. "First baby?" "Yes." "Any bleeding? Fluid?" "Water broke an hour ago. Some blood, but not—" She gasped as another contraction hit, her whole body going rigid. Gideon waited for it to pass, then looked at Evelyn. "I need to check how far along she is. Stay by her head. Hold her hand if she needs it." What followed was the longest night of Evelyn's life. Margaret's labor didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated, the contractions coming so close together there was barely any rest between them. Gideon stayed calm through all of it, checking the baby's position, monitoring Margaret's condition, giving quiet instructions that Evelyn followed as best she could. "More towels, fresh water, hold her shoulders while she pushes." Hours blurred together. Margaret screamed herself hoarse. Evelyn's arms ached from supporting her weight. Gideon's face was set in concentration, sweat running down his temples despite the cold air seeping through the cabin walls. "Something's wrong," Margaret sobbed during a brief respite. "It shouldn't hurt this much. Something's wrong." "The baby's in a difficult position," Gideon admitted. "Not breech, but not ideal either. I'm going to have to help turn it. Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This is going to hurt worse than anything so far, but I have to do it or the baby won't come out safely. Do you understand?" Margaret's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. "Evelyn, hold her hand. Don't let go no matter what." What Gideon did next looked brutal from Evelyn's vantage point, though she knew he was being as gentle as possible. His hands disappeared beneath the sheet, and Margaret screamed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, primal and desperate. Evelyn gripped her hand tighter, murmuring things that probably made no sense but seemed to help anyway. "Almost there," Gideon said through gritted teeth. "Almost. There. Got it." He pulled back, breathing hard. "Next contraction. You push with everything you have. Understand? Everything." Margaret nodded weakly. The next contraction came within seconds. Margaret bore down with a sound that was half scream, half growl. Gideon's hands were working, guiding, supporting. "Good. Again. Don't stop. I can't. You can. Push." Evelyn found herself pushing too somehow, as if she could will the baby out through sheer force of empathy. Margaret's hand was crushing hers, but she didn't care, didn't feel it, was only aware of the woman's pain in Gideon's steady voice and the desperate need for this to end well. "Heads out," Gideon said. "One more push, just one more." Margaret gathered herself for one final effort, and then suddenly there was a different sound in the cabin, thin and reedy and unmistakably alive. A baby's cry. Evelyn's knees went weak with relief. Gideon was moving fast now, clearing the baby's airway, checking for breathing problems, wrapping the tiny body in clean cloth. "It's a girl," he said, and there was something in his voice that Evelyn had never heard before. Wonder, maybe, or the kind of relief that came from snatching life back from the edge. He placed the baby on Margaret's chest, and the new mother burst into tears, her hands coming up to cradle her daughter with a tenderness that made Evelyn's throat tight. "She's perfect," Margaret sobbed. "She's perfect." But Gideon was still working, delivering the afterbirth, checking for hemorrhaging, making sure Margaret was stable. His hands were steady, but Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at the blood-soaked linens like he was calculating whether it was too much. "Evelyn, I need fresh water and the yarrow tincture. The bleeding's more than I'd like." She moved on autopilot, bringing what he needed, following his terse instructions. Gideon worked for another 20 minutes before he finally stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're going to be fine," he told Margaret, "but you need to rest. No getting up for at least 2 days. Evelyn will bring you food and water. If the bleeding gets worse or you develop a fever, you tell us immediately." Margaret nodded, too exhausted to speak, her attention entirely on the baby in her arms. Gideon turned to Evelyn and jerked his head toward the door. She followed him outside into the bitter cold, closing the door behind them. He walked a few steps away from the cabin and just stood there, breathing hard. His hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed, the adrenaline draining out of him all at once. "Are you all right?" Evelyn asked. "That was close." His voice was rough. "Another 15 minutes, and we would have lost one or both of them. The baby was stuck. The cord was starting to compress." He broke off, running a hand through his hair. "Too close. But you saved them." "This time." He looked at her. "Not every time. You need to know that. Sometimes we do everything right, and people still die. Sometimes babies don't cry. Sometimes mothers bleed out faster than we can stop it. Sometimes—" "I know," Evelyn interrupted gently. "You've told me. But tonight, they lived. That has to count for something." Gideon stared at her for a long moment, something complicated crossing his face. Then he nodded once and turned back toward the cabin. "Come on, we need to clean up and set up a proper bed for her. She can't go home in this weather, not with a newborn." Margaret stayed for 3 days, recovering in Evelyn's bedroom while Evelyn slept on a makeshift pallet near the fire. The new mother needed help with everything, feeding the baby, getting up to use the chamber pot, changing bandages. Evelyn found herself learning a different kind of medicine during those days, the practical aftercare that nobody talked about but everyone needed. On the morning of the 4th day, Margaret's husband arrived, half mad with worry, having ridden through a snowstorm to get there. He swept into the cabin like a force of nature, then stopped dead when he saw his wife sitting by the fire nursing their daughter. "Andrew?" Margaret said, smiling through sudden tears. "Meet Charlotte." The big man's face crumpled. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside his wife's chair, gathering both of them into his arms as gently as if they were made of glass. Evelyn turned away to give them privacy and found Gideon watching from the doorway, something achingly sad in his expression. He noticed her looking and cleared his throat. "I'll help him prepare the horse," he said gruffly, and disappeared outside. Later, after the Chen family had left with profuse thanks and promises to repay them in lumber and labor come spring, Evelyn found Gideon in the barn, ostensibly checking on the goats, but clearly just keeping himself busy. "You were thinking about Sarah," she said. He didn't deny it. "We wanted children, tried for 3 years. She got pregnant twice, lost them both early on. Then the fever took her before we could try again." He ran a hand along Brutus's back, the goat surprisingly tolerant of the attention. "Andrew gets to watch his daughter grow up. I don't begrudge him that. But it hurts to see sometimes what I'll never have." Evelyn moved closer, not touching him, but near enough that he'd know she was there. "Sarah would be proud of what you do here. How many lives you've saved." "Doesn't bring her back." "No. But it means something anyway." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Evelyn felt the air change between them, felt the weight of all the unspoken things that had been building for months. Gideon opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then seemed to think better of it. "We should get back inside," he said instead. "Storm's coming." But he was wrong about what kind of storm was coming. 2 weeks later, on a bright cold morning that hurt to breathe, 3 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Evelyn saw them first from the window where she was grinding herbs and felt her stomach drop. She knew that horse, knew the way the lead rider sat his saddle like he owned the world. "Gideon," she said, her voice coming out strangled. "My brother's here." Gideon was beside her in an instant, looking out the window. His jaw tightened. "How many brothers do you have?" "2. That's Caleb, the oldest, the worst one." "Armed?" She looked closer. "Yes. All 3 of them are carrying rifles." "Stay inside." Gideon was already reaching for his own rifle above the door. "No matter what happens, you stay inside until I say otherwise." "Gideon, promise me, Evelyn." She wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him, face her brother together. But the look on Gideon's face was absolute. "I promise," she said. He nodded and stepped outside, rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. Evelyn pressed herself against the window, close enough to hear but hopefully not visible. Caleb Mercer dismounted with the swagger of a man used to getting his way. He was tall and broad like their father had been before the drinking hollowed him out, with the same weak chin hidden under a carefully groomed beard. The 2 men with him stayed on their horses, hands resting on their weapons. "Gideon Vale," Caleb called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Been looking for you." "Congratulations on finding me," Gideon said evenly. "Now you can turn around and ride back down the mountain." "Can't do that. I've got business here." Caleb pulled a folded paper from his coat. "See, turns out this land you're squatting on belongs to my family, has for 3 generations. I've got the deed right here." "That's a lie," Gideon said flatly. "That's legal documentation." Caleb's smile was sharp. "Filed with the territorial court and everything, which means you're trespassing, which means I can ask you to leave, politely, of course. I've been on this land for 6 years, built this cabin with my own hands, never seen any Mercer up here before today. Well, we're here now," Caleb gestured expansively. "And we're prepared to be reasonable. You pack up, move along, and we'll forget this whole misunderstanding. You dig in, and things get complicated. Your choice." Gideon stood very still. "This is about Evelyn." "This is about property rights," Caleb corrected. "But since you mentioned my sister, she needs to come home. Father's dying, and the family needs her back where she belongs. Your father sold her to settle his debts. She doesn't owe him or you anything." "That's not how family works." Caleb's voice hardened. "She's coming back one way or another. You can make this easy or you can make this hard, but the outcome's the same." Inside the cabin, Evelyn felt her hands curl into fists. She recognized this version of Caleb, the one who hid threats inside reasonable-sounding words, who always left himself room to deny being the aggressor while getting exactly what he wanted. "Evelyn's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go," Gideon said. "See, that's where you're wrong." Caleb nodded to the men behind him. "We're prepared to enforce our legal rights to this property, which means you've got about 1 hour to pack whatever you can carry and get gone. After that, we start dismantling what's ours." "You're not touching this cabin. Are you willing to bet your life on that?" Caleb's hand drifted toward his rifle. "Because I brought friends who are real good at removing obstacles." The threat hung in the cold air. Evelyn could see the calculation happening on Gideon's face. 3 against 1, all of them armed, Caleb clearly willing to escalate to violence if it suited him. But before Gideon could respond, the cabin door opened and Evelyn stepped out. "Evelyn, get back inside," Gideon started. "No." She walked down the steps, putting herself between Gideon and her brother. "I'm not hiding from him anymore." Caleb's expression shifted to something almost pitying. "Evelyn, look at yourself, living up here like some kind of savage, playing at being useful. This isn't you. This isn't the life you were meant for." "You're right," she said clearly. "The life I was meant for was being traded like livestock to pay for Father's mistakes. This is the life I chose instead." "Father's dying," Caleb said, and there was real emotion in his voice now, anger barely controlled. "He's asking for you, wants to make peace before the end, and you're up here playing house with this—" He gestured dismissively at Gideon. "Hermit who bought you like you were worth nothing." "He didn't buy me," Evelyn said. "He offered me a choice. That's more than you or Father ever did. I'm offering you a choice now. Come home, fulfill your duty to this family, or stay here and watch us burn everything you've built to the ground." Caleb's voice dropped. You think I won't do it? You think I won't put him, he jabbed a finger at Gideon, in the ground if that's what it takes? Caleb, you've got 1 hour, her brother said, swinging back into his saddle. After that, this place becomes a memory. The three riders turned and headed back into the tree line, but Evelyn noticed they didn't go far. She could still see the smoke from their fire just beyond the clearing's edge, waiting. We need to leave, Gideon said the moment they were back inside. Now. Pack light, just what you need to survive. We'll ride to the territorial court, file a counterclaim, get an injunction. How long will that take? 3 days there, 3 days back if the weather holds, and we push hard. He was already moving, gathering supplies. Maybe a day at the courthouse if we're lucky. A week, Evelyn said. He'll burn everything in a week. Better than being shot today. What if we fight? Gideon stopped, turning to look at her. 3 armed men against 1? Those aren't odds I like. Then we make them better odds. Evelyn's mind was racing. The lumber camp, Andrew Chen said they owed us. There are 20 men up there who know what you've done for them. I'm not starting a range war over a cabin. This isn't just a cabin. Evelyn moved closer, forcing him to look at her. This is your home, your life's work. 6 years of helping people, of being the only medical care for 50 miles. If Caleb takes this land, where do they go when they're hurt? When their wives are in labor? When their children are sick? Gideon's jaw worked. Even if I could get help from the camp, we'd still need legal standing. Without proof of ownership, this is just one claim against another. Then we get proof. Evelyn grabbed her coat. The territorial office keeps records. If Caleb filed a claim, it's on record. But so is your homestead. You've been here 6 years. That's legal occupation. We find someone who can testify to that, bring them to the courthouse with us, and his whole scheme falls apart. That's still 3 days. So we don't give him 3 days. Evelyn was talking fast now, the plan forming as she spoke. We go to the lumber camp tonight, get testimony, ride out before dawn with enough men that Caleb won't dare try to stop us. We file the counterclaim, get the injunction, and we're back before he can do any real damage. Gideon stared at her. You've been up here 3 months, and you're already thinking like you were born to it. Do you have a better plan? He didn't. They both knew it. All right, Gideon said finally. But we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get the law on our side, and we come back with enough force that violence isn't an option. They prepared quickly, packing light but taking everything they'd need for a hard ride. As the sun started to sink behind the peaks, they slipped out the back of the cabin and into the forest, making their way toward the lumber camp by a route Caleb and his men wouldn't be watching. The forest was dark and treacherous in the failing light, but Gideon moved through it with the confidence of someone who knew every tree, every rock, every game trail. Evelyn followed as closely as she could, trusting him to guide her safely. They were halfway to the camp when disaster struck. The trail they were following curved along the edge of a cliff, not a sheer drop, but steep enough that a fall would be serious. Evelyn's horse, nervous from the strange route and the fading light, spooked at something in the shadows. It sidestepped violently, and suddenly Evelyn was sliding, the saddle shifting, the ground disappearing beneath her. She grabbed for the reins, the pommel, anything, felt her fingers close on leather just as her weight pulled her completely out of the saddle. Then she was hanging, one hand locked on the reins, her legs dangling over nothing, the horse panicking and trying to pull away, which was only making things worse. Evelyn? Gideon's voice sharp with fear. She couldn't answer. All her concentration was on holding on not looking down, on trying to get her other hand up to grab something more stable. The horse reared, and Evelyn felt her grip slipping. Then Gideon was there, out of his saddle and grabbing her horse's reins with one hand, while his other arm went around Evelyn's waist. He pulled hard, dragging her back from the edge, both of them falling into the dirt well away from the cliff. For a moment they just lay there, breathing hard. Evelyn's hands were shaking so badly she couldn't make them stop. "Are you hurt?" Gideon demanded, his hands already moving over her arms, her legs, checking for damage. "No, I don't think so." Her voice came out thin. "The horse, I've got her." He'd somehow kept hold of both sets of reins. "You're all right. You're safe." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight against his chest, and Evelyn felt him trembling, not from cold, from fear. I thought I lost you, he said roughly into her hair. Another second, and I'm here, she said. I'm all right. They stayed like that for a long moment, neither willing to let go. Then Gideon pulled back just enough to look at her face, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. I'd rather lose the land than lose you, he said, and there was no calculation in the words, no thinking, just raw truth. Everything else can be rebuilt. But you... He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Evelyn understood what he wasn't saying, understood it had taken nearly watching her fall to break through whatever walls he'd built around his heart. Then we don't lose either, she said firmly. We fight for both. Gideon searched her face for another moment, then nodded and helped her to her feet. They checked the horses, made sure nothing was damaged, and continued toward the lumber camp with a new urgency driving them forward. The camp was a collection of rough buildings carved out of the forest, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Men were finishing their evening meal when Gideon and Evelyn rode in, and the reception was immediate and warm. Andrew Chen spotted them first and came running, baby Charlotte bundled against his chest. Gideon, what brings you? Is something wrong? I need help, Gideon said, and the words clearly didn't come easy to him. And I need witnesses. It took 20 minutes to explain the situation. By the end, Andrew's face was dark with anger, and the other men who'd gathered were muttering among themselves. That's horse shit, one of them said bluntly. Begging your pardon, miss, he added to Evelyn, but everyone knows this land was unclaimed before Gideon built here. If it belonged to anyone, it was the mountain itself. I need someone who can testify to that, Gideon said. Someone who was here when I first arrived, who knows I've been in continuous occupation for 6 years. I can do that, said an older man with gray hair and weathered skin. Name's Marcus Webb. I've been running timber up here for 15 years. Was here the summer you started building, helped you raise the first walls. I'll swear to that in any court they want. So will I, Andrew said, and I'll ride with you. Make sure these Mercer bastards don't try anything on the trail. We all will, another man added, and there was a rumble of agreement from the others. Gideon looked overwhelmed. I can't ask you to leave your work. You didn't ask. We're offering. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. You saved my boy's life last winter when the fever came through. You've patched up half the men here at one point or another, never asked for more payment than what we could afford. This is what neighbors do. They left before dawn, 8 men on horseback, moving fast down trails that would have been suicide to attempt in full dark, but were merely dangerous in the pre-dawn gloom. Caleb and his men were still camped near Gideon's clearing when they passed, but 8 against 3 were different odds entirely. No shots were fired. No confrontation happened. They just rode past and kept going. The courthouse in the territorial capital was a sturdy building that seemed wildly out of place among the rough frontier towns surrounding it. The clerk who met them was unimpressed by their urgency until Marcus started laying out the facts, backed by testimony from men whose hands showed they knew real work when they saw it. The judge, when he finally appeared, was old and sharp-eyed and clearly had no patience for fraudulent land claims. You're saying Caleb Mercer filed a deed claim on land that's been occupied for 6 years. He looked at the papers Caleb had filed, then at the testimony Gideon's witnesses were providing. And he's currently threatening violence to enforce this claim? Yes, Your Honor, Gideon said. The judge made a note. I'm issuing a temporary injunction preventing any action on the disputed land until this can be properly investigated. If Mr. Mercer or his associates interfere with your property in any way, they'll be arrested for contempt. He looked up. I'm also requesting that the territorial marshal investigate the authenticity of this deed. It smells like fraud to me. The marshal in question was a hard-faced woman named Catherine Wells, who listened to the whole story with increasing displeasure. By the end, she was practically spitting. Forged deeds, she said disgustedly. Always forged deeds. All right, Mr. Vale, you've got your injunction. I'll ride back with you personally to serve it. Anyone tries to stop me from doing my job, they'll learn real quick why that's a poor decision. The ride back took 2 days, pushing hard. When they crested the final ridge and looked down at Gideon's clearing, Evelyn's heart sank. Smoke was rising from where the cabin should have been. They'd burned it anyway. Gideon made a sound low in his throat and spurred his horse forward, the others following. But as they got closer, Evelyn realized the smoke wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from a bonfire in the clearing where Caleb and his men had piled furniture, supplies, anything they could carry out. The cabin itself still stood, but the door had been smashed in and the windows broken. They'd started the destruction but hadn't finished it. Caleb was standing by the fire, watching them approach with his arms crossed. When he saw the marshal's badge, his confident expression faltered. "Caleb Mercer," Marshal Wells said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "You're under arrest for attempted fraud and destruction of property. You have the right to—" Caleb ran. He made it about 20 feet before Andrew Chen, who'd been a logger for 15 years and knew a thing or two about moving fast, tackled him into the snow. The other two men Caleb had brought tried to help him, but the lumber camp workers surrounded them quickly, and it became clear that fighting was going to end badly for everyone involved. Marshal Wells cuffed Caleb with brisk efficiency. "The deed was forged," she told him conversationally. "We found the real one in the territorial records. Turns out this land was claimed by a mining operation 30 years ago, abandoned 20 years ago, and has been unclaimed ever since. Which means Mr. Vale's homestead claim is legitimate, and your paperwork isn't worth the paper it's printed on." Caleb's face had gone white. "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one. In jail." She hauled him to his feet. "Anyone else want to confess to being part of this scheme before I start asking hard questions?" The other two men started talking immediately, tripping over each other to explain that Caleb had paid them. They didn't know the deed was fake. They were just hired help. Marshal Wells looked unimpressed but took their statements. Then she turned to Gideon. "I'll need your testimony for the trial, but your land rights are clear. This cabin and everything on it belongs to you legally." Gideon was staring at the damaged cabin, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Marshal." After Wells left with her prisoners and the lumber camp men headed back to work with promises to help rebuild, Evelyn and Gideon stood alone in the clearing, looking at the destruction. "We can fix this," Evelyn said quietly. "The structure's sound. We just need to replace the door, repair the windows, clean up the mess they made." "He came after you," Gideon said. "Used the land as an excuse, but he came after you." "And we stopped him." Gideon turned to look at her. "You could have been killed on that cliff. You could have been hurt when Caleb and his men broke in. You could have—" "But I wasn't." Evelyn moved closer. "We're both standing here. The cabin still stands. We won. This time." His voice was rough. "What about next time? What about all the dangers that come with this life, the weather, the isolation, the people who need help in the middle of the night, the cliffs and the cold, and everything else that could take you away?" "The same things that could take you away," Evelyn pointed out. "The same risks you've been living with for 6 years. That was different. I was alone. If something happened to me, no one—" He stopped, shook his head. "Now there's you. And the thought of something happening to you because I brought you into this life—" "You didn't bring me into anything," Evelyn interrupted firmly. "I chose this. I chose you. I chose the mountains and the danger and the hard work because it's real in a way nothing in Black Hollow ever was. Because for the first time in my life, I matter. The work matters. What we do here matters." She took his hand. "I'm not asking you to stop worrying about me, but don't let that worry make you push me away. Don't let it make you think I'm better off somewhere safe and comfortable and completely wasted." Gideon looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You're sure? Because once we—" He swallowed hard. "Once we acknowledge what this is, there's no going back." "I don't want to go back," Evelyn said. "I want to stay right here." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her like she was something precious and breakable and worth protecting with everything he had. Evelyn wrapped her arms around him and held on just as tightly, both of them standing in the wreckage of what they'd almost lost, understanding that they'd been given something most people never found: a second chance, a real choice, each other. "We should check the damage," Gideon said finally, though he didn't let go. "In a minute," Evelyn said. "Let's just stand here for a minute." So they did, as snow began to fall softly around them, covering the scars Caleb had left, making everything clean and new again. The minutes stretched into 5, then 10, before Gideon finally pulled back and looked at the cabin with the practiced eye of someone assessing damage. He was already cataloging what needed to be fixed, Evelyn could tell: the broken windows, the splintered door, the supplies that would need to be replaced or salvaged from the bonfire's wreckage. "Come on," he said quietly. Let's see how bad it is. Inside was worse than Evelyn had braced herself for. Caleb and his men had gone through the cabin like a storm, overturning furniture, smashing jars of preserved food, scattering medical supplies across the floor. Her bedroom door hung crooked on its hinges. The table where they'd shared meals and where she'd delivered Charlotte Chen into the world had been hacked with an axe, deep gouges marring its surface. But they hadn't destroyed everything. The structure itself was sound. The fireplace still worked. Most of the medical instruments had been thrown around but not broken, too valuable to damage probably, in case Caleb had actually succeeded in taking the property. Evelyn bent to pick up a jar of yarrow tincture that had rolled under the overturned rocking chair. Miraculously, it hadn't broken. She set it carefully on the counter and started gathering others. "Leave it," Gideon said. "You should rest." "So should you, but we both know neither of us will sleep until this place looks like home again." She found another intact jar, then another. "Besides, I've been wanting to reorganize the medicine shelf anyway. You have everything mixed together with no system." Despite everything, Gideon almost smiled. "There's a system, you just haven't learned it yet." "The system is Gideon knows where everything is and everyone else can go to hell," Evelyn said. "That's not a system, that's chaos with confidence." This time he did smile, brief but real. "Fair enough." They worked through the night, righting furniture, sweeping up broken glass, salvaging what could be saved and setting aside what couldn't. Around midnight, Evelyn found her church dress in a corner of her bedroom, slashed to ribbons. Caleb's final petty cruelty, destroying the last physical connection to her old life. She stood there holding the tattered fabric, surprised to find she didn't feel much of anything. That dress had never been hers anyway. It had been her stepmother's statement, her father's bargaining chip, the town's judgment made material. Losing it felt like shedding dead skin. "You all right?" Gideon asked from the doorway. "Better than all right," she said, dropping the ruined dress into the pile of debris. "He thought he was taking something from me. But all he did was cut the last thread connecting me to people who never wanted me in the first place." Gideon crossed the room and took her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Their loss," he said simply. "My gain." He kissed her then, gentle and deliberate and full of promise. When he pulled back, Evelyn felt steadier than she had since the moment she'd seen Caleb riding into the clearing. "We're going to be fine," she said. "Yeah," Gideon agreed. "We are." By the time the sun rose, the cabin looked almost normal. They'd boarded up the broken windows temporarily. Gideon would need to ride to the trading post for new glass when the weather cleared. The door was rehung, if not perfectly. The floor was swept. The medical supplies were organized according to a system Evelyn had devised that made actual sense, though Gideon grumbled about not being able to find anything anymore. They collapsed into chairs at the salvage table, drinking coffee and watching the light change through the boards covering the windows. "We need to talk about what happens next," Gideon said after a long silence. Evelyn's stomach tightened. "All right. Your father's dying. Caleb said so, and even though he's a lying bastard about most things, I don't think he'd make that up." Gideon stared into his coffee. "You should go see him. Make your peace or don't, but you should have the choice." "I don't want to go back there." "I know, but you'll regret it if you don't. Trust me on that." His voice went rough. "I never got to say goodbye to Sarah. She was fine in the morning, fevered by noon, gone by midnight. I'd give anything for one more conversation, even a hard one." Evelyn knew he was right, hated that he was right, but knew it anyway. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "If you want me to." "I do." She reached across the table to take his hand. "I can't face Black Hollow alone. Not after everything." "Then you won't have to." They left 3 days later, after Gideon had secured the cabin and made arrangements for the Chen family to check on the animals while they were gone. The ride down the mountain felt different this time. Evelyn wasn't running toward an unknown future, but returning to a past she'd thought she'd escaped. Black Hollow looked exactly the same. The same buildings, the same people, the same atmosphere of judgment barely concealed beneath a veneer of civility. But Evelyn felt different walking through it. She sat straighter in her saddle, met the stares of former neighbors without flinching, let them see what their unwanted daughter had become. They stopped at the house where she'd grown up, smaller and more run down than she remembered, paint peeling from the shutters. The front step cracked. Her stepmother answered the door, took one look at Evelyn, and tried to slam it in her face. Gideon's boot stopped it. "We're here to see Thomas," he said mildly. "You can let us in, or we can wait for the marshal to come explain property rights to you. Your choice." The stepmother, Martha, her name was Martha, though Evelyn had trouble thinking of her as anything but that woman, stepped back with a scowl. "Upstairs, last room. Don't expect thanks for showing up now." The stairs creaked under their feet. The hallway smelled like sickness and unwashed sheets, and the particular staleness that came from keeping windows closed against fresh air. Evelyn's childhood bedroom door stood open, revealing a space that had been stripped of everything personal and converted to storage. Her father's room was at the end of the hall. Thomas Mercer looked like a ghost of himself. The stroke had left him partially paralyzed, his face slack on one side, his speech slurred, but his eyes were clear when Evelyn stepped through the door, clear and full of something that might have been shame. "Evie," he managed, "you came." "Don't call me that." She stayed by the door, Gideon a solid presence at her back. "You lost the right to nicknames when you traded me away." Thomas tried to sit up, failed, fell back against his pillows. "I'm sorry. I know it don't mean much now, but I'm sorry." For what, specifically? Evelyn found she needed to hear him say it. For the gambling, for the drinking, for treating me like property, for letting Martha and Caleb make my life hell, for selling me to the first man who offered to pay your debts? All of it. Her father's good hand clutched at the blanket. "Your mother, she'd be ashamed of me. What I became, what I did to you." "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "She would be." The bluntness of it seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might be crying. When he opened them again, he looked at Gideon. "You been good to her?" "That's between Evelyn and me," Gideon said evenly. "Not your business anymore. She looks healthy, strong." Thomas's attention came back to Evelyn. "You're different, not the scared girl who stood at that altar." "The mountains change people," Evelyn said. "So does being treated like a human being instead of a burden." Her father flinched. "Caleb said you and your man took everything from him, got him arrested." "Caleb tried to steal land that didn't belong to him and got caught," Evelyn corrected. "That's not on us. That's on him being a cheat and a liar, just like you taught him to be." "Evie," I said, "don't call me that." She took a breath, trying to find the words for what she needed to say. "I came here because Gideon said I'd regret it if I didn't. Because even though you were a terrible father, you're still dying, and I'm not cruel enough to deny you this conversation. But I'm not here for reconciliation. I'm not here to forgive you and make you feel better about your choices." "Then why are you here?" Thomas asked quietly. "To tell you that I survived despite you, not because of you. To tell you that I built something real and good and meaningful with my life, no thanks to anything you ever did for me. And to tell you that I'm done carrying your failures around like they're my responsibility." She moved closer to the bed, standing tall. "You made your choices. You lived your life. Now you get to die knowing that the daughter you threw away turned out just fine without you." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his ruined face working. "You're right," he said finally, "about all of it. And I'm proud of you. For getting out. For making something of yourself. Even if I don't deserve to be. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough to make up for 26 years of neglect and cruelty and casual dismissal. But it was something. An acknowledgement. A final dropping of the pretense that he'd ever been anything other than what he was. "Goodbye, Father," Evelyn said, and turned toward the door. "Wait." Thomas's voice stopped her. "There's a box under the floorboard by the window. It was your mother's. I should have given it to you years ago, but Martha—" He stopped. "It's yours. Take it." Evelyn found the loose board, pried it up, and pulled out a small wooden box she vaguely remembered from childhood. Inside were letters, a cameo necklace, and a journal filled with her mother's handwriting. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Then she walked out without looking back. Martha was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed. "He leave you anything? Because the house and what's left of the money are mine by law." "I don't want anything of yours," Evelyn said. "Or his. I've got everything I need." "Living in the wilderness like some kind of animal," Martha sneered. Playing at being a healer when everyone knows you're just his whore. Gideon moved so fast Evelyn barely saw it. He didn't touch Martha, but he leaned in close enough that she stumbled backward, and when he spoke his voice was ice. You get one chance to take that back and apologize. Just one. Martha's face went white. Whatever she saw in Gideon's expression made her think better of pushing further. My apologies, she said stiffly. I spoke in haste. Yeah, Gideon said, you did. He turned to Evelyn. Let's go. We're done here. They rode out of Black Hollow without stopping, without looking back. Evelyn waited for the tears to come, for the weight of everything to crash down on her. But instead she felt lighter, like she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. You all right? Gideon asked once they'd cleared the town limits. I think so. She looked back once, briefly, at the buildings disappearing behind them. I thought it would be harder, saying goodbye. Sometimes the hardest goodbyes are the ones we've already said 100 times in our heads, Gideon said. The actual words are just making it official. They stopped at the trading post on the way back up the mountain. While Gideon was inside ordering window glass and other supplies, Evelyn sat on the porch with her mother's box, carefully reading through the letters and journal. Her mother had been a healer too, she discovered. Not formally trained, but knowledgeable about herbs and remedies, sought out by neighbors who couldn't afford real doctors. The journal was full of recipes and observations and notes about patients, written in a careful hand that reminded Evelyn of her own handwriting. The last entry was dated 3 days before her mother died. It read, Evie shows promise. She remembers everything I teach her, asks good questions. When she's older, I'll give her this journal. Let her carry on what I've started. She has a gift for caring, my girl. Hope she never loses it. Evelyn closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, feeling tears finally coming. Not for her father. For her mother, who'd seen something in her that no one else had bothered to look for. Who'd believed in her potential even when Evelyn was too young to understand it herself. Found something good? Gideon asked, emerging from the trading post with his arms full of packages. Yeah, Evelyn said, wiping her eyes. I think I did. The ride back up the mountain took on a different quality. The higher they climbed, the easier Evelyn breathed. By the time the cabin came into view, she felt like she was finally coming home rather than running away. Over the next weeks, they fell into a new rhythm. The cabin was fully repaired with the glass Gideon had ordered and the lumber Andrew Chen sent down from the camp. Evelyn reorganized the medical practice, using her mother's journal as a guide, incorporating old remedies with what Gideon had taught her. Together, they created something stronger than either of them could have built alone. Winter settled in hard. Snow piled higher than the windows. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in the basin overnight even with the fire burning. But inside the cabin, life continued. They treated patients who braved the storms to reach them. They delivered 2 more babies, twins this time, which tested every bit of knowledge they possessed. They sat by the fire in the evenings, reading or talking or sometimes just existing in comfortable silence. And slowly, so gradually, that Evelyn couldn't pinpoint when it happened, they stopped pretending there was still distance between them. It started with small things. Gideon's hand on the small of her back when he passed behind her. Evelyn leaning against his shoulder when they sat together by the fire. The way they'd started saying we instead of I when talking about the practice, the cabin, the future. One night in late January, during a blizzard that had buried the world in white, Evelyn woke to find Gideon kneeling beside her bed. What's wrong? She asked, instantly alert. Is someone here? Do we have a patient? No. His voice was rough. I can't sleep. Can't stop thinking about... He broke off, running a hand through his hair. Forget it. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have woken you. He started to stand, but Evelyn caught his wrist. Thinking about what? The cliff. When your horse spooked, I keep seeing you fall. Keep watching you slip over the edge, and I'm not fast enough to... His breath caught. It's been months, and I still wake up in a cold sweat thinking I lost you. Evelyn sat up, pulling him closer. I'm right here. I'm fine. I know. Logically, I know that, but... He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. I can't lose you, Evelyn. I can't go through that again. And I'm terrified that this life, the work we do, the dangers that come with living up here, I'm terrified that one day I'll wake up and you'll be gone and it'll be my fault for bringing you into this. Gideon. She took his face in her hands, making him look at her. I chose this. I choose it every single day. The danger, the isolation, the hard work, all of it. Because this is real. This matters. You matter. You matter to me, he said hoarsely. More than the cabin, more than the practice, more than anything. And I don't know what to do with that. You could start by admitting it, Evelyn said softly. By saying what we both know, but keep dancing around. Gideon's throat worked. I'm not good at this. Words, feelings. Sarah used to get so frustrated with me because I'd show her how I felt, but I could never say it properly. Then show me, Evelyn said. He kissed her like he was trying to prove something, like he could communicate through touch what he couldn't put into words. Evelyn kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring everything she felt into it. The gratitude, the respect, the bone-deep certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, but absolutely sincere. I think I have since the moment you chose to come with me instead of staying safe, and I'm done pretending I don't. I love you too, Evelyn said. I think I have since you bought me those boots without asking for anything in return. He laughed, surprised. That's what did it. Boots? It was the first time anyone had cared whether I was cold. She traced the scar on his face gently. The first time I understood what kindness without conditions looked like. They stayed like that, holding each other while the blizzard raged outside and the fire crackled in the main room. Eventually, Evelyn shifted to make room for him in the narrow bed, and Gideon climbed in beside her, pulling her against his chest. This doesn't change anything about the work, he said into her hair. We're still equals, still partners. I know. And we're not rushing into anything. We take our time, do this right. Okay. I'm serious, Evelyn. I won't treat you like property just because we... Gideon. She turned in his arms to face him. I know. You've spent 4 months proving that you see me as a person, as a partner. I trust you. Now stop talking and go to sleep. He huffed a quiet laugh and tightened his arms around her. Yes, ma'am. They fell asleep like that, tangled together in a bed that was too small but somehow perfect. While outside the wind howled and the snow kept falling and the world was reduced to just this, two people who'd found each other against all odds and decided to hold on. Morning came bright and brutal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Snow had buried everything at least 5 feet deep, sculpting the clearing into soft, rolling shapes that bore no resemblance to what had been there before. Evelyn woke to find Gideon already up and dressed, starting a fire to push back the cold that had crept in overnight. He looked over when he heard her moving and smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made him look years younger. Morning, he said. Morning. She wrapped a blanket around herself and padded over to the fireplace. How bad is it out there? Bad enough that we'll be digging out for hours. Good news is anyone who needs help won't be able to get to us, which means we can focus on work around here. He poured coffee and handed her a cup. Also means we're alone. Properly alone. Probably for days. There was a question in his tone, a tentative hopefulness that made Evelyn's heart squeeze. I can think of worse ways to spend a few days, she said. They spent the morning digging paths to the barn and the root cellar, feeding the animals, making sure nothing had been damaged by the storm. The physical work felt good, and working side by side felt natural in a way it hadn't even a month ago. Like something had clicked into place between them, some final piece settling into its proper position. In the afternoon, they returned to the cabin, frozen and exhausted. Gideon built up the fire while Evelyn made soup from preserved vegetables and dried meat. They ate together at the repaired table, and Evelyn found herself watching him, the way his hands moved, capable and sure. The way he'd push his hair back from his forehead when he was thinking, the small smile that appeared when he caught her looking. What? He asked. Nothing. Just, this is good. Being here with you. Having time that isn't about emergencies or patience or surviving the next crisis. It is good, Gideon agreed. He reached across the table to take her hand. I know I'm not easy to live with. I'm too quiet, too set in my ways, too... Perfect for me, Evelyn interrupted. You're perfect for me, exactly as you are. I was going to say stubborn. That too. She grinned. But I'm stubborn enough to match you, so we're even. They cleaned up together, falling into the routine they'd established over months of shared work. Then Gideon did something unexpected. He took her hand and led her to the rocking chair by the fire, sat down and pulled her into his lap. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked, startled. "Holding you." He wrapped his arms around her waist. "Is that all right?" "More than all right." She settled against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. "Tell me about Sarah." She felt him tense, then gradually relax. "Why?" "Because she was part of your life, part of what made you who you are. I don't want her to be this thing we never talk about." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, one hand coming up to stroke her hair absently. "She was fierce," he said finally. "Small, but fierce, afraid of nothing. She'd stand up to drunk minors twice her size if they were mistreating someone, drag me out to help people in the middle of the night, work herself to exhaustion if someone needed her." "She sounds amazing." She was. "And she'd like you, I think. You remind me of her sometimes, the way you don't back down, the way you care about the work even when it's hard." He paused. "But you're different too. Quieter in your strength, more careful with trust." "I had to be," Evelyn said. "The world wasn't kind to me before you." "I know." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be. It led me here." She tilted her head back to look at him. "To you." He kissed her properly then, slow and thorough and full of promise. When they broke apart, his eyes were dark with want, but also with something deeper. Commitment, certainty, the kind of feeling that couldn't be rushed or forced. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not now, necessarily. Not until you're ready. But someday. I want to build a life with you that's ours, not something we fell into by accident, but something we chose deliberately." Evelyn's throat went tight. "I want that too." "Yeah?" "Yeah." She cupped his face in her hands. "When this winter's over, when spring comes and the world thaws out, ask me then. Ask me properly, and I'll say yes." "That's a long time to wait." "It's 3 months. We've already waited this long. We can wait a little longer to do it right." She kissed him again. "Besides, it'll give us something to look forward to besides the next emergency." Gideon laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "Fair enough." They stayed like that as the light faded and the fire burned low, talking about plans for the future, about the second room they'd add to the cabin come spring, about the garden they'd plant, about the life they'd build together piece by piece. Outside, the world was frozen and harsh and unforgiving. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Evelyn finally understood what home really meant. Not a place, not a building, but this. Two people choosing each other, again and again, building something real out of honesty and hard work and love that didn't demand perfection but accepted reality. She'd started this journey as payment for a debt she hadn't owed, standing at an altar in a town that had never wanted her. Now she was here, in the arms of a man who saw her clearly and loved her anyway, building a future that was entirely theirs to shape. The mountains had changed her. But Gideon had changed her too, in ways that went deeper than survival skills or medical knowledge. He taught her that she deserved kindness, that her work mattered, that she was enough exactly as she was. And she taught him that love could grow again after loss, that letting someone in didn't mean losing yourself, that taking a chance on partnership was worth the risk. Together, they were building something that neither of them could have created alone. Not just a medical practice, not just a homestead, but a sanctuary where broken things could be mended and lost people could find their way. As night fell completely and the stars came out sharp and brilliant in the frozen sky, Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself feel completely, unreservedly happy. Not the desperate happiness of someone escaping something worse, but the deep, settled contentment of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged. The winter would pass. Spring would come. And when it did, she'd say yes to the future Gideon was offering, because it was the same future she was offering him. 2 lives intertwined, stronger together than apart, facing whatever came next side by side. For now, this was enough. This moment, this warmth, this love that had grown quietly between them, like something planted in good soil, tended with care, and allowed to flourish in its own time. More than enough. Everything. Spring came late that year, reluctant and grudging, the snow refusing to release its grip until well into April. But when it finally arrived, it came all at once. The ice breaking up in the streams with sounds like rifle shots, wildflowers pushing through the last patches of snow. The world going from white to green almost overnight. Evelyn stood on the porch of the cabin watching the transformation and thinking about promises. Gideon had said he'd ask her properly when spring came, and here it was, brilliant and impossible and real. She waited. Days passed. Gideon seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. He kept starting conversations and then stopping, kept looking at her like he wanted to say something important, and then losing his nerve. Finally, after weeks of this, Evelyn cornered him while he was repairing the fence around the goat pen. "Are you going to ask me, or are you waiting for another season entirely?" she said bluntly. Gideon looked up from the post he was hammering, startled. "What?" "You said you'd ask me to marry you in the spring. It's spring. I'm waiting." He set down the hammer and wiped his hands on his pants, suddenly looking younger and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "I was trying to find the right moment." "This is the right moment," Evelyn said. "We're standing in goat manure and you've got dirt on your face, and I probably smell like the chamomile I was processing all morning. It's perfect." Despite his nervousness, Gideon laughed. "You have a strange definition of perfect. I have a practical definition of perfect." She moved closer. "Ask me, Gideon." He took her hands, his grip warm and slightly trembling. "I don't have a ring yet. I was going to order one from the trading post. I don't need a ring. I need you to ask me the question." Gideon took a breath. "Evelyn Mercer, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here? Help me run this practice? Put up with my stubbornness and my silences and all the ways I'm not easy to live with? Will you let me love you for as long as we both live?" "Yes," Evelyn said without hesitation. "To all of it. Yes." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her hard, then immediately pulled back. "You're right. You do smell like chamomile. And you smell like goat. We're made for each other." They were married 6 weeks later in the clearing in front of the cabin, with no church and no congregation. Just Marcus Webb from the lumber camp serving as witness, Andrew and Margaret Chen with baby Charlotte, a handful of other families from the high country who'd been helped by their practice, and Marshall Wells who'd ridden up to make sure the paperwork was filed properly with the territorial office. Evelyn wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Gideon had brought back from the trading post, nothing like the too-tight monstrosities she'd worn at that first wedding. This one fit. This one was hers. Gideon wore his best shirt and looked terrified. There was no reverend, no elaborate ceremony. Marcus just asked them if they wanted to be married. They both said yes, and he pronounced them husband and wife with the casual authority of someone who'd done this favor for friends before. "That's it?" Gideon asked. "That's it," Marcus confirmed. "You're married. Try not to kill each other." "We'll do our best," Evelyn said. The celebration afterward was simple. Food everyone had brought, coffee and cider, Andrew pulling out a fiddle Evelyn hadn't known he could play. People danced in the clearing while the sun set behind the peaks, and for a few hours the hardness of mountain life gave way to something lighter. But the celebration ended early. It always did up here, where morning came ruthlessly soon, and work didn't care about hangovers or lack of sleep. People drifted away to their own cabins and camps, leaving Evelyn and Gideon alone in the gathering darkness. "So," Gideon said, "we're married." "Apparently." Evelyn looked at the ring he'd slipped on her finger during the ceremony. Simple silver, no stone, exactly what she would have chosen. "How do you feel?" "Terrified. Happy. Like I might wake up and find out this was all a dream, and I'm still alone in this cabin." "Not a dream." She laced her fingers through his. "Real. Complicated. Probably going to be harder than we're expecting, but real." They went inside together, and if what happened next wasn't some romantic ideal of a wedding night, it was honest. They were both exhausted. Gideon knocked over a chair in the dark and swore. Evelyn couldn't stop laughing at his embarrassment. They fell into bed together more relieved than passionate, holding each other close and falling asleep mid-conversation about whether they needed to check on the goats one more time. It was perfect because it was theirs. No performance, no pretense. Just two people choosing each other, again and again, in ways both grand and mundane. The real work of marriage, Evelyn discovered, wasn't the dramatic moments. It was learning how to exist alongside another person through the grinding repetition of daily life. It was negotiating who did which chores, learning each other's rhythms, figuring out when to push and when to give space. It was Gideon leaving the bigger portion of meat on her plate every single night until she finally told him to stop, that she didn't need him to sacrifice for her, and him looking genuinely confused because he hadn't even realized he was doing it. It was Evelyn reorganizing his tool shed, and Gideon spending 3 days grumpy about not being able to find anything before grudgingly admitting her system was better. It was small kindnesses that became habits. Gideon always banking the fire before bed so Evelyn wouldn't wake to cold. Evelyn always making his coffee exactly the way he liked it without being asked. Both of them learning the shape of the other's needs and meeting them without fanfare. But it wasn't seamless. They had their first real fight in late May over something stupid. Whether to use their limited funds to buy medical supplies or repair the barn roof that was starting to leak. Evelyn said medical supplies because people's lives mattered more than keeping the goats dry. Gideon said the barn because if it collapsed in the next heavy snow, they'd lose the animals they needed to survive the winter. They were both right. They were both stubborn. It escalated until they were shouting at each other, saying things that weren't quite fair, not quite true, but felt necessary to say anyway. Finally, Evelyn threw up her hands. "Fine. Do whatever you want. You clearly think you know better than me anyway." "That's not—" Gideon stopped, visibly forcing himself to calm down. "That's not what I think. I think we disagree about priorities, which is normal. What's not normal is you assuming I don't value your opinion. You're the one with 20 years of experience up here. I've been here less than a year. Why would you listen to me? Because you're my wife. Because you're my partner. Because your opinion matters even when I disagree with it." He sat down heavily at the table. "We're going to have to figure out how to do this. How to disagree without it meaning one of us doesn't respect the other." Evelyn sat down across from him, still angry but willing to try. "Okay. How?" "I don't know." He ran a hand through his hair. "Sarah and I we had this rule. When we disagreed about something important, we'd each make our best case, sleep on it, and come back the next day with a compromise. Forced us to actually listen instead of just waiting for our turn to talk." "That seems reasonable." Evelyn took a breath. "For what it's worth, I understand why the barn matters. When I think about someone dying because we didn't have the right supplies, I know. And when I think about losing the animals and not being able to help people through the winter because we're starving ourselves." He shook his head. "We'll figure it out. Together." They did. The compromise was fixing the worst of the barn damage themselves with lumber Andrew sent down, and using the saved money for the most critical medical supplies. It wasn't perfect, but it was workable. More importantly, it set a precedent. They could fight. They could disagree. They could be frustrated with each other. But they could also work through it, find middle ground, stay committed to the partnership even when it was hard. Summer brought its own challenges. A drought dried up the smaller streams, making water scarce. A series of accidents at the lumber camp kept them running back and forth for weeks, treating injuries that ranged from minor to life-threatening. A family of settlers passed through with a sick child, measles, and despite everything Evelyn and Gideon did, the boy didn't make it. That night, Evelyn sat on the porch steps and cried while Gideon held her, both of them carrying the weight of a life they couldn't save. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked. "No," Gideon said honestly. "You just get better at carrying it." "I hate that." "Me too." But the work continued because it had to, because people needed them, and there was no one else. Because choosing this life meant accepting both the victories and the losses, the saves and the failures. One afternoon in late July, a woman rode into the clearing with a request that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "There's a girl," the woman said. Her name was Patricia, and she ran a boarding house in one of the mining settlements. "Young thing, maybe 15, Patricia lowered her voice. "She's with child. Not married. Father's threatening to throw her out, and the boy who got her that way has already left the territory. She's desperate and scared and asking about ways to end the pregnancy." Gideon's face went carefully neutral. "Where is she now?" "Hiding at my place. I told her I'd ask you first, see if—" Patricia stopped. "I don't know what I'm asking exactly, just that she needs help." After Patricia left with a promise they'd come by in the morning, Evelyn and Gideon sat in tense silence. "What are we going to do?" Evelyn asked finally. "What we always do. Help." Gideon's voice was tight. "But this is complicated, dangerous, medically and legally. If something goes wrong, I know." Evelyn had read enough in her mother's journal to understand the risks, the moral complications, the way women had always found themselves trapped between judgment and survival. "What did you and Sarah do when someone asked?" "We helped them understand their options, all of them. Talked about adoption, about support, about the medical risks of ending a pregnancy versus carrying to term, and then we let them choose." He looked at her. "We never refused help, but we also never made the choice for them. That's theirs to carry." They rode out the next morning to Patricia's boarding house. The girl, her name was Rachel, and she looked closer to 14 than 15, sat hunched in a corner, eyes red from crying. Evelyn sat down beside her while Gideon waited outside, understanding that this conversation needed to be between women first. "Tell me what you want," Evelyn said gently. "I don't know." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "My father says I've shamed the family, says I can't come home. The boy he's gone, said it wasn't his problem. Everyone's talking about me like I'm nothing." "You're not nothing," Evelyn said firmly. "You're a person in a terrible situation, and you deserve help, not judgment." "My father says—" "I don't care what your father says. I'm asking what you want, not what anyone else thinks you should do. What do you want?" Rachel looked up, startled by the directness. "I want to not be pregnant. I want to go back to before this happened. I want—" She broke down sobbing. Evelyn held her while she cried, thinking about her own father, her own shame, the way people weaponized judgment against young women who'd made mistakes or been taken advantage of or just gotten desperately unlucky. When Rachel finally calmed down enough to talk, Evelyn laid out the options. Adoption. There were families who wanted children, carrying to term and raising the baby herself, hard but possible with support. Or ending the pregnancy, risky, painful, but possible if done early enough with proper care. "I can't have a baby," Rachel said finally. "I'm 15. I have no money, no home, no husband. I can't do it." "Okay," Evelyn said. "Then we'll help you. But you need to understand the risks. Your body, your choice. But you need to know what you're choosing." What followed was one of the hardest days of Evelyn's medical career. Gideon walked Rachel through everything that would happen, the pain she'd experience, the bleeding, the possibility of complications. He was clinical but kind, making sure she understood without trying to scare her into a different choice. Rachel listened to all of it and still said yes. The procedure itself was quick but brutal. Rachel gripped Evelyn's hand hard enough to leave bruises, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. Gideon worked with steady hands and a set jaw, doing what needed to be done as safely as he knew how. Afterward, they kept Rachel at the boarding house for 3 days, monitoring for infection, making sure the bleeding was normal, ensuring she was physically recovering. Patricia fed her, gave her a place to sleep, treated her with the matter-of-fact kindness of a woman who'd seen too many girls in similar situations. On the 4th day, Rachel was well enough to travel. Her father still wouldn't take her back, but Patricia had found her a position at a ranch 50 miles south. Kitchen work, room and board included. No questions asked about her past. Before she left, Rachel hugged Evelyn tight. "Thank you for not making me feel like I was wicked for choosing this." "You're not wicked," Evelyn said. "You're surviving the best way you know how. That's all any of us can do." After Rachel left, Evelyn found Gideon in the barn, ostensibly checking on the goats, but clearly just needing space. "You all right?" she asked. "I hate that we had to do that. I hate that she was put in that position. I hate that there's no good answer, just a series of bad options where she has to pick the least terrible one." He turned to face her. "But I'm glad we could help. Glad she had somewhere to go where she wasn't judged for being human." "Do you ever think about having children?" Evelyn asked. "You and me, I mean." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "I think about it sometimes. Think about what it would be like to have a child in this cabin, to teach them what we know, to watch them grow." He paused. "But I also think about all the ways it could go wrong. Childbirth kills women up here. Children die from fevers, from accidents, from 100 things we can't control. And I don't know if I could survive losing both of you. So that's a no? That's an I'm terrified but willing if you want it. He took her hands. What do you want? Evelyn considered the question honestly. I don't know. I like our life as it is. The work, the partnership, the freedom to focus entirely on helping others. A child would change everything. It would. But maybe someday, she said. Not now. But maybe someday when we're more settled, when the practice is more established, when the cabin has that second room you keep promising to build. Maybe then. Maybe then, Gideon agreed and kissed her forehead. For now, we've got enough to handle without adding a screaming infant to the mix. Fall came with its usual warnings. Early frosts, animals preparing for winter, the light changing to something golden and desperate. Evelyn and Gideon worked frantically to prepare, preserving everything they could, stockpiling medicine, making sure the cabin was ready for months of isolation. The first major storm hit in late October, earlier than usual, catching everyone off guard. A family trying to make it to the lower settlements got trapped halfway down the mountain. Parents and 3 children, the youngest barely 2 years old, huddled in a cave with insufficient supplies and no way to light a proper fire. Word reached the cabin through a hunter who'd spotted their smoke. Gideon grabbed supplies immediately, but when he tried to go alone, Evelyn blocked the door. We go together or we don't go at all, she said. It's too dangerous. The trail's already icing over. Which is exactly why you need backup. If you fall, if you get hurt, those people die and so do you. She was already putting on her warmest clothes. We're partners, Gideon. That means we share the risks. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. They'd spent a year building this partnership. He couldn't protect her by leaving her behind, and she wouldn't let him face danger alone just because it was what he'd always done. They rode out into the storm together, following the hunter's directions to a cave system about 3 miles up a treacherous trail. The wind cut through their clothes like knives. Snow fell so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Twice Gideon's horse nearly lost its footing on ice. Once Evelyn's did, and she had to trust her training, her mount, and the man in front of her to get through it. The family was in bad shape when they found them. The father had frostbite on his hands and feet. The mother was feverish, probably infection from a cut that had gone bad. The children were hypothermic, the youngest barely responsive. Gideon and Evelyn worked through the night, warming bodies carefully to avoid shock, treating frostbite, fighting the mother's fever with everything they had. It was brutal, exhausting work done in impossible conditions with limited supplies and no guarantee any of it would be enough. But as dawn broke gray and cold, all 5 members of the family were alive, stable, going to survive if they could get to proper shelter soon. The storm had passed enough to attempt the journey back. Gideon fashioned a travois for the weakest family members. They made it to the cabin by noon, then sent word to the lumber camp for help getting the family the rest of the way down the mountain once they were strong enough to travel. That night, collapsed in exhausted heaps near the fire, Evelyn and Gideon didn't speak. They didn't need to. They'd done it together, faced the danger, shared the burden, saved 5 lives that would have been lost if either of them had tried to handle it alone. That was the moment Evelyn understood something crucial about the life they'd built. It wasn't about being strong enough to survive alone. It was about being willing to depend on each other, to trust completely, to know that neither of them was enough by themselves, but together they were formidable. Winter settled in for real after that, deep and unforgiving. The cabin became their entire world for weeks at a time, snow piling so high they had to dig tunnels to reach the barn. But they'd prepared well. They had food, firewood, each other. They spent the long, dark evenings reading from the small library Gideon had accumulated over the years. Evelyn worked her way through her mother's journal again, this time adding her own notes and observations. Gideon taught her more advanced medical techniques, using the quiet time to deepen her knowledge. And they talked, really talked, about their pasts, their fears, their dreams for the future, about the mistakes they'd made and the people they'd lost, and the ways they were both still learning how to be better. I used to think I needed to be perfect, Evelyn admitted one night. Growing up, it felt like the only way to be acceptable was to have no flaws, no needs, no complications. Just be quiet and small and useful, and maybe people wouldn't notice all the ways I didn't fit. And now? Gideon asked. Now I know that's garbage. Being human means being flawed, messy, complicated, needing help sometimes, making mistakes. She looked at him. You taught me that. Just by being yourself, scarred and stubborn and imperfect and still completely worthy of love. You taught me something too, Gideon said quietly. I thought being alone was safer, less risk of loss, less pain when things went wrong. But what I learned this year is that being alone isn't safe. It's just lonely. And loneliness is its own kind of death, slower, quieter, but just as final. They held each other as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside. Two people who'd found their way through the darkness to something real and lasting. Spring came again, inevitable and welcome. The snow retreated, the world came back to life. And with it came news from the territorial capital. Caleb had been sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud and attempted extortion. Their father had died in February, quietly, without asking to see any of his children again. Evelyn felt nothing when she heard. Not grief, not relief, just the distant acknowledgement that a chapter of her life was finally, completely closed. Do you want to go back? Gideon asked. See the grave, make peace? No, Evelyn said. I made my peace when I chose to leave. Everything after that was just confirmation I made the right choice. Instead, they spent the spring building the second room Gideon had promised. It wasn't for a child, not yet, maybe not ever. It was for storage, for a proper workshop space for preparing medicine, for the expansion of a practice that kept growing as word spread about the healers in the high country who actually gave a damn about their patients. More families moved up into the mountains, drawn by cheap land and the promise of new starts. A small settlement began to form about 10 miles from Gideon's cabin. Nothing like a real town, but enough houses clustered together that they started calling it something. Pinewood, they decided, after the trees that surrounded it. And when people in Pinewood got sick or hurt or needed help delivering babies, they came to Evelyn and Gideon. One afternoon in late May, almost exactly 2 years after Evelyn had first ridden into these mountains, a young woman arrived at the cabin asking for work. I heard you take apprentices, she said nervously. I heard you teach people to be healers. Evelyn and Gideon exchanged glances. We've never formally taken an apprentice, Gideon said carefully. What makes you think we would? Because... The young woman hesitated. Because I heard about a woman who was traded away to settle her father's debts, and instead of accepting that fate, she became a healer who saves lives. And I thought, I hoped, maybe there was room for another woman who needs a different life than the one she's being offered. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. She looked at this young woman, couldn't have been more than 19, thin and scared, but here anyway, asking for the kind of chance Evelyn herself had been given, and understood that this was how it worked. How good things spread. One person offering a hand, and then that person offering a hand to someone else, creating chains of opportunity that reached farther than any individual could imagine. What's your name? She asked. Hannah. Hannah Wright. Well, Hannah Wright, healing is hard work, dangerous, exhausting. You'll see people at their worst. You'll lose patience despite doing everything right. You'll work until your hands bleed and your back screams, and you'll still have to get up the next day and do it again. Evelyn paused. But it matters. The work matters. Saving lives matters. And if you're willing to commit to learning, we're willing to teach. Hannah's face transformed with relief and hope. Thank you. Thank you. I'll work hard, I promise. We know, Gideon said, and there was something almost amused in his expression as he looked at Evelyn. We've got experience with determined women who show up asking for chances they shouldn't have to ask for. They set Hannah up in the newly built second room and began her training the next day. Watching her struggle through the same lessons Evelyn had mastered, seeing her frustration and determination and gradual growth, Evelyn felt like she was seeing herself from 2 years ago, lost and desperate and willing to do whatever it took to build something better. But she also felt the difference. She wasn't that frightened woman anymore. She was the healer teaching the next generation. She was the wife building a life with a partner who saw her clearly. She was the woman who'd proven to herself that she could survive, thrive, matter. One evening after Hannah had gone to bed and Gideon was closing up the cabin for the night, Evelyn stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. Gideon came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. What are you thinking about? That church in Black Hollow. standing at that altar feeling like my life was over before it really began. She leaned back against his chest. If someone had told me then that 2 years later I'd be here, married to you, running a medical practice, teaching an apprentice, saving lives, I wouldn't have believed them. Would you go back? Gideon asked. If you could do it differently, choose something easier? Evelyn didn't even have to think about it. Not for anything. This life is hard, but it's mine. This work matters. She turned in his arms to face him. This love we built is real. I wouldn't trade any of it for all the safety and comfort in the world. Good, Gideon said and kissed her. Because I'm not letting you go. They stood there as darkness fell and the first stars appeared. Two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built something that neither of them could have created alone. Not a perfect life. There was no such thing. But a real one, full of meaning and purpose and the kind of love that came from truly seeing another person and choosing them anyway. The mountains rose up around them, ancient and indifferent and beautiful. The cabin behind them was warm and solid, filled with the tools of their trade and the evidence of lives saved. The future ahead was uncertain, as all futures were, but they'd face it together. And that, Evelyn had learned, was the only certainty that mattered. Not safety, not comfort, not the approval of people who'd never valued her anyway. Just this: partnership, purpose, and the daily choice to show up for each other no matter what came. She'd started this journey as payment for a debt she didn't owe, standing at an altar in a town that had never wanted her, about to be claimed by a man everyone called a monster. Now she stood on a mountain she called home, beside the man she loved, living a life she'd built with her own hands and her own choices. The woman who'd been traded away was gone. In her place was Evelyn Vale, healer, wife, teacher, survivor. Someone who mattered. Someone who made a difference. Someone who'd learned that the only permission you needed to build a better life was your own willingness to reach for it. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the night settled in around them, Evelyn closed her eyes and felt completely, unreservedly at peace. This was home. This was love. This was everything she'd never known she could have, earned through hard work and honesty and the courage to keep choosing herself even when it would have been easier to accept what others decided she deserved. The mountains had tested her. Gideon had believed in her. But in the end, she'd saved herself. And that made all the difference.